Welcome to Talking Pictures. My name is Christian Genzel. I'm a filmmaker and film journalist from Salzburg, Austria. Talking Pictures is a podcast series in which I talk to the people who made some of my favorite movies. Today's guest is Zak Penn, best known as a screenwriter on several big-budget superhero movies like X-Men 2, X-Men The Last Stand, The Incredible Hulk, and The Avengers. Zak also wrote the 1993 comedy Last Action Hero starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he directed a wonderful mockumentary called INCIDENT at Loch Ness, in which he, together with German director Werner Herzog, ventures out to find the Loch Ness monster. My conversation with Zak focuses on his work on Steven Spielberg's 2018 sci-fi movie Ready Player One, which Zak adapted from Ernest Cline's novel by the same name. The story is set in 2045 and revolves around a virtual reality world called the Oasis, which is largely based on the pop culture of the 1980s, recreating early video games, cult movies, and the pop music of the decade. The story follows a teenager named Parzival and his friends and their quest to find and solve a series of hidden clues and puzzles, so-called Easter eggs, hidden within the Oasis by its late creator, a Steve Jobs-like figure by the name of Jim Halliday, who promised that whoever solves his game will gain complete control over the Oasis. Along the way, Parzival falls in love with a girl he meets in the Oasis named Artemis, receives a little help from Halliday's former business partner Ogden Morrow, and he fights the so-called Sixers, an army of treasure hunters led by the evil Nolan Sorrento, whose company IOI seeks control over the Oasis for commercial gain. In our interview, Zak discusses how he adapted Ernest Cline's book and how certain choices and changes were made to make the story more cinematic. He talks about the characters and the pop culture that informs the story, and he discusses how one of the movie's best scenes came about, a segment where the characters enter a recreation of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining in order to solve a puzzle. Zak also talks about his 2014 documentary Atari Game Over, which was in many ways a precursor to his work on Ready Player One. It's the story of digging up the infamous Atari 2600 game E.T., which was buried in a landfill in New Mexico. And it features not only several themes which are connected to Ready Player One, but it also stars Ernest Cline as one of the protagonists. The interview with Zak Penn was conducted in connection with our German-language podcast Lichtspielplatz, so if you speak German, please visit www.lichtspielplatz.at and check out episode number 46, which features an in-depth discussion of Ready Player One. If you enjoy my conversation with Zak Penn, please visit www.talkingpicturespodcast.com to check out our other episodes and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. So without further ado, here is Talking Pictures with Zak Penn discussing how he became involved with Ready Player One.
I was sent, I think, galleys of Ready Player One before it came out. And my assistant at the time, well, he wasn't my employee at the time, this guy, Mike Chamoy, read it and said, you should really look at this. This would be a good thing for you to do. And it had been offered. I think it had been offered, or it was going to be offered. And I read it and, I really loved the book, but I thought this is not makeable in its present form. I mean, who could direct a movie like this and get all the clearances? So I kind of let it drop. And then when I got hired to do the Atari documentary, which was just, it was a lunch meeting I had where they proposed, whoever it was at Xbox, I forget now, said, hey, we're making a documentary about digging up the E.T. game. I was like, I'm in. She's like, well, it's very low budget. I was like, I'm in. That's what I want to do next. So I went off to do that. And very quickly, it became apparent that, Ernest Cline would be the perfect person to be a talking head in this movie. And then, we were already planning. I mean, other people had already planned and done the research on Atari Game Over on where to, the E.T. games, the supposed E.T. games were buried in the New Mexico desert. So when we announced that we were going to dig it up, which had already been in play, Ernie decided to do a pilgrimage. So we ended up, while we were making the documentary, I got offered the job of rewriting Ready Player One. And partly because I was so steeped in, going over my, I was in a documentary, obviously you do all this research and you get steeped in the period, and it was my childhood. When it came back to me again, I was like, what the hell? I'm going to do this. And it was just a coincidence. And when I finally, Ernie heard about it, obviously. So when we finally met, it was just kind of funny. We were just laughing about we ended up talking a lot about the movie and how to adapt it. He was not, the previous draft had gone in a really different direction for budgetary reasons, I think. So, I had kind of a pitch on it that was much closer to the original vision he had. But mostly we became fast friends just over being in the desert together. You go into the desert and dig up a bunch of things from a garbage dump and you grow close to people. But we ended up having a lot of discussions. And as soon as the movie was over, I started working on a rewrite. That's how it all came about. I mean, Donald DeLine was the producer who called me directly, who's a friend of mine. And I just happened to, I actually, truth be told, Warner Brothers owed me money from a project that I had done a number of years before. I don't know if this is more business detail than you want, but one of the things in Hollywood is often when a project gets canceled or if they decide to move on to another writer, they settle you out and they pay you some of what they owe you. And I never had that happen. And I said, I don't really want you to pay me for something I haven't done. Why don't we just agree that the steps that you owe me, we'll find something to do at some point and you can just pay me then. And that was 10 years or something. No, maybe it was 8 years before they ever sent me anything that I liked. So it was a really easy deal. They said, we just want you to take a whack at one draft. And I said, sure, pay me the money you owe me. And they were like, that's great. It was a good deal for them. And, the rest was history. Wrote one draft. They sent it to Steven Spielberg without telling me, and next thing you know, we're off to the races.
So what did the script look like when you came on board?
Well, there had been a couple of drafts. I mean, Ernie had written in the original draft, which was very, very faithful to the book, which, Ernie even said to me, one of the things that's good about actually calling the people whose work you're adapting and becoming friends with them, whether they are novelists or screenwriters that you've been hired to rewrite their script or whatever, it's not, I'm a big believer that you owe it to the person who stared at the blank page to go and talk to them, particularly if you're being paid well to rewrite them. And that's partly from my own experiences at the opposite end of it, but it's partly, I just think it's the right and smart thing to do. So I had a lot of discussions with Ernie about, and his first adaptation, just didn't work for him. He just felt like I couldn't pack it all into a doable length. The next iteration was actually a perfectly good script by this guy, Eric Eason, but it was so different. It was much more of a thriller, and it was an attempt to make it as a $40 or $50 million movie. So, I just kind of went back. They said, just write whatever you want it to be. And I said, okay, I'm just going to write this giant movie then and hope you guys can figure it out. And, from Ernie's point of view, that meant bringing back a lot of what he wanted. But, there's also a lot of invention. There's a lot of things that I felt like there are things in the book, like the Halliday journals, which, I said to Ernie straight up, I don't think we want to watch a character reading journals. And I have this idea that what if we put them in the Oasis and make them virtual so that you can walk through it like a museum? So, there's a lot of ideas like that came up early, and I ran them by Ernie before I even wrote them. So, the ones that he liked, he was very enthusiastic about and often offered me ideas. And the ones that he really didn't like, he told me, he said, well, but won't that, then you won't be able to do this, this, and this. So it was a pretty collaborative process to begin with.
Yeah, one of the major differences, I guess, between the book and the movie are the challenges that Parzival and the other players participate in. So I was wondering how you sort of arrived at the versions that were in the movie.
Well, first of all, and it's funny because Ernie has a very passionate fan base. So and there's a very passionate fan base for the book. So I often would, I would meet people who are fans of the book who'd say, why did you change the challenges? And I always said, Ernie changed them first. I mean, he knew that we had to turn them into something physical, that was a little bit more kinetic for the screen. So there was already a mandate that, of course, we were going to change the challenges. And like the race sequence was something that, was an idea that he had already been kicking around. So that one, I just kind of embraced and went with. But in general, I felt like, the challenges and the contests are great in the novel, but you just have to limit how much of that you can do in a movie. I mean, you cannot spend a movie with 25 minutes of sleuthing through trivia. It's just not, it's just not going to work. And the other thing is that you have to make the challenges visually dynamic. I mean, once Steven Spielberg came on, that became even less of an issue because of course he was going to do that and do that well. But I just felt it was a narrative imperative that, like, one of the things that was hurting even the earlier adaptations was that it was trying too hard to tell the story in a linear way. And you needed to kind of start with the contest already about to be broken open. You know what I mean? It's very easy in a novel to say 5 years later, no one's done anything. But, in a movie, a time jump like that has to be motivated. It can't be motivated by trivia, if you will. So, it was a two-pronged challenge. One was, what are the coolest possible sequences we can come up with? Because we're working in this incredible fantasy world where anything is possible. So, let's not just make it playing a game, like even something like bringing Joust to life, which that was one we certainly considered. But still, it involves a lot of playing. And I felt like, if anything, we should save some of the actual old school gaming stuff for the very end, because it would be intercut with a lot of other action. Whereas, watching someone, a race scene was a good idea, for example. That was a good way to show, A, nobody had finished it, but B, here's an exciting sequence to watch, while you're hoping that the character can figure it out. So that was a very early discussion that, very quickly evolved into some of the, I always knew, for example, when I read the book, as much as I liked the idea of movioki, right? That kind of, you go into a movie and you have to recite all the lines exactly. That is not a good idea for the screen, in my opinion. It just would be dull for people who don't know you know what I mean? It just would be a strange thing. But on the other hand, I had written Last Action Hero. That was my first script, which is about a kid getting sucked into a movie, which Ernie knew, by the way, and what, always told me inspired him. And I was like, well, we have to do, instead of movioki, it has to be that you go into the movie and can change, you have to go through the movie in your own way, and you encounter the characters, and there's jeopardy involved, and it's just a fun sequence. And at one point it was even multiple movies that you were going through. But originally that was going to be Blade Runner. I wrote many iterations of a Blade Runner challenge, but it ended up being The Shining for a variety of reasons. So, but that's much later. That was after Steven came on. He, we went through everything and revamped, we kind of fully, did his full process of development, where we went through every assumption and every choice, and, got rid of changed the ones that didn't work and honed the ones that did. And, had a team of storyboard artists and great artists from ILM and all these other people giving input, all in development. I mean, that's one of the best things about working with him, is that we had a year where we were just working on the script and using all the departments at his disposal to help make the script better, so that by the time you finished, you don't have this document that none of these people over here actually can do. It might read well on the page, but it doesn't work. That's what makes him such a great and efficient filmmaker, is he has a totally different process. So,
yeah, and I think you also, you streamlined the challenges in a way that in the book there's always a couple of challenges sort of rolled up into one. You have to not only find the dungeon, but you have to go through the dungeon, and then you have to play Joust, or at the end you have to go through the Holy Grail, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but you would also have to play Tempest. And there's, I think, a third challenge connected to the Jade Key. I don't remember what it was now.
Right. Each of the challenges is 3 challenges. And I, immediately said, well, we have to streamline this too. That was kind of a no-brainer decision, because that obviously in the book he can get away with it, and the movies you just don't have an unlimited time. The reader can't meander through, or the viewer can't meander through a movie. They've got to be pushed along. So you can't just do 3 little challenges in a row. It has to be, this is the one thing that needs to be done. Mostly you want to tell the story about the characters. So challenges and mysteries are interesting background things in a movie, but they can't be the focus. They really have to be, they have to serve character purpose. And if they don't, you can only, the audience often doesn't realize it, but if there's no real story going on, you can't put up with that many seconds of screen time without saying, wait, are we still on the same beat? Are we, people don't really articulate it, but you can feel an audience get comfortable when they're like, nothing, this is just more solving. There's no change in the character's circumstances. It's just a longer sequence. And, that's true of chase scenes as well. And Spielberg is one of the best people, probably the best person to watch, to see how something is constructed cinematically. There's always, even within action sequences, there's always lots of twists and turns in terms of the characters, the jeopardy to the characters, and sometimes even story turns within the action sequences. One of Steven's big mantras was take dialogue that's important and put it into the action sequence. Don't stop the action sequence to have dialogue. Just, if they're gonna have a shootout in Zero Gravity, that's where he should start talking about his feelings for her, and that was a, great, obviously it's not hard when Steven Spielberg tells you to do that. You would, even if I didn't agree with it, I would have done it. But obviously you're like, oh yeah, of course, that's why your movies are so great. So, yeah. So slimming the challenges down was, that just had to be done. That was a non-controversial one as well,
Did you discuss how the different challenges would influence the character of Jim Halliday? How he came across?
Well, this was my own reading of the book. Look, I feel strongly that, you have to, I'm not the first to say it. It's a very old proposition and it's true, but part of it is probably from working on a bunch of X-Men movies, where I always approached every script I wrote as, okay, Magneto, he's not just the hero of his own story, but he's actually right. Most of the time his methods might be extreme, but he really is right about what's going to happen. And that's what makes the conflict between him and Xavier, who's got all the right intentions, but is often wrong about what to do. So, writing from the types of stories where the villain's objectives are beyond reasonable, they even make a bit more sense than the hero's journey does. I felt like, we had to look at the villains from 2 different perspectives. First of all, I felt strongly that somebody in this movie had to acknowledge the idea that this contest is not a good idea, right? I mean, it goes without saying, when you read the book and when you talk to fans, they all talk about like this contest is clearly being a good idea. But the Oasis is the engine for the economy of this future world. And the idea that you would have a contest based on trivia to pick the person who's now in charge of, Apple, Google, Facebook, and, Exxon Mobil combined, or whatever it would be, there is a childishness and a ludicrousness to it. And something that I thought spoke to, one of the themes in the book, which is it's not a very healthy attitude to just be obsessed with trivia. So Sorrento, that was one of the first things I attacked. Is I was like, we have to make Sorrento someone whose point of view on this challenge is entirely reasonable to him, which is that, which is different than it is in the book, obviously. And the other thing was Halliday. I mean, I felt like when I read Halliday's story that particularly his attitude towards Kira and some of his attitudes towards things. And talking to Ernie, I think some of this is in the book and people don't necessarily realize it. But Halliday is a very ambiguous character. I mean, Morrow is heroic. Morrow's head is on, you know what I mean? He always, and particularly, you know, in the movie, we accentuated that this is a guy who's trying to do things the right way. But Halliday, like many tech leaders, is not, you know, this kind of almost super heroic figure that people trust implicitly that they know what they're doing. And, you know, it's funny because to me, that's what, when I see the final product, I feel like here's a cautionary tale about not trusting the vision of individual Silicon Valley, you know, tech billionaires, and rather questioning whether they really, what they're doing is a good idea. So once I started to think about the challenge as this more ambiguous prospect that wasn't just clearly a good idea because it picked our hero, it also brought a lot of questions up about, you know, is Halliday as positive a figure as he's portrayed, even as people treat him? You know, they treat him with a certain reverence, both, you know, the fans do, the book does, the movie does in its own way. But I also wanted to show you this wasn't a very good way for him to live his life, you know, and that there had to be some cautionary aspect to the whole thing. You know, and that led to a lot of interesting discussions, believe me, because, you know, not everyone agreed with me on that, but I felt like that was essential, that you need, you know, in terms of balance, you've got Morrow over here, who is clearly trying to do the right thing all the way through. And you have Sorrento over here, who is trying to, he thinks to do what he thinks is the right thing, but clearly in the wrong way. And maybe he's very wrong about what the right thing to do is. And Halliday is somewhere in the middle in an ambiguous place. You know, I mean, certainly some of the things he does to Kira just felt to me like that's not the behavior of somebody in love. That's, you know, that's negative behavior. So that's the way I read it. And I read the book and the movie as, I know to some people it's weird, but I see it as a cautionary tale about nostalgia and, you know, a cautionary tale about, you know, looking into the mirror for our inspiration as opposed to looking forward. And to me, Halliday represented somebody who could not really, you know, he couldn't get out of his own way. You know, he wasn't this genius who'd been exploited and was a figure of pity. He was an incredibly wealthy guy who was wrapped up in his own mind. And that's why, by the way, Mark Rylance's performance, what's crucial to it is he brings a tremendous amount of humility and likability to the role, so that it's not just watching like a bratty jerk, but he also definitely plays a guy who doesn't care enough about other people's feelings, you know? So, you know, there were structural reasons for that. I thought there were thematic reasons why that was important. You know, it had to be about, it couldn't be about Wade learning to be like Halliday, because Halliday left the world a mess, you know? I mean, he really did, right? And he kind of left the Oasis a mess too, because there was no clear, because Sorrento was coming, you know, IOI was coming pretty close to taking it over, which was also not a good succession plan, you know, for the Oasis. So to a certain extent, it's got to be about Wade learning from Halliday's mistakes and not wanting to be like him. And, you know, and by the way, in all the years, Ernie and I laugh about it, I get so confused now between what was in the book, what was in the script, what Ernie and I came up with together, what Ernie came up with separately, what I came up with separately. But those crucial changes felt like from the beginning, I mean, that was part of my first pitch. Like, we have to realign the moral center of this movie, you know, and make sure that Halliday plays as an ambiguous figure, because it's also what adds to some of the tension of the challenges, which is it's not all fun and games, you know, and you don't know. I mean, the Shining sequence particularly, it's kind of a dark and unpleasant, parts of it are fun, but part of, the whole structure of it is, and this is something that Ernie and I did really agree on by the time we got there, because we kind of came up with the sequence together, is that you're not supposed to feel that great about Halliday when you see what that challenge is all about. It's, chaining up Kira's likeness, inside a horror movie is not exactly, it's not something to be lauded. It's something to be conquered, I mean, there are certain things where it's just right off the bat, the challenges, the Halliday journals, how we would show flashbacks if we did do them, the roles of the villains and etc. I mean, all of that stuff was right off the bat, question. And I, not a question, but something that I pitched my own take on. So, and I felt like that's what the movie would need to work. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point about the Halliday character, because in the book it's fun to read, but I was thinking that, I don't know if being able to quote the entirety of War Games would somehow, I don't know, it wouldn't be something that I could do, even though I love War Games and I've seen it like dozens of times. But also, I don't think it would sort of prove that I would be a good person to run the Oasis just because I've memorized something. Whereas in the movie, it's more about, I think, learning from somebody's mistakes. I mean, it's still a very self-centered contest in a way. It's all about Halliday, but that's the kind of person he is. But it's a more personal thing, I think. It's just he's trying to find somebody who's clever enough to figure it out. He doesn't have to be a very good gamer. He just needs to be somebody who understands the things that were driving him.
Right. Well, one thing that Ernie got, I think, 100% right is there is a value, and this is something that's in my Atari documentary. People devalue fans over what they like. If you walk into a room and say, anywhere in the world and say, oh, I'm a fan of Shakespeare, there's not a lot of people who are going to say, what a waste of time. I mean, there probably are these days, some extreme theorist. But for the most part, everybody understands like that's accepted as a worthy use of your time. There's a lot of people that think reading comic books, including when I was growing up, my parents thought this isn't serious. It's a waste of time. This is like, they were thinking they were like cartoons or something I was reading in the Sunday paper. And no, they're works of literature and art that have become more and more sophisticated and are worthy of study. And one of the points of the book, certainly, is that anything that inspires you, in a deep way to both understand it better, to research it better, to communicate and be connected with other people is not a bad thing. I mean, unless it's, there's some obviously ideologies that are bad and you should try to avoid. But in general, the scholarship, if you will, that Halliday required seemed to me the most reasonable part of it, which is knowing a lot about Halliday is like knowing a lot about Churchill if you want to learn, about English, governance or whatever. So I never saw there being a problem in Wade being an expert in the things Halliday loved and Halliday building a contest that's built around it, because it still required effort and research and intelligence and you know what I mean? Like there's still, those are all positive notions. The negative side of it is obsession, right? Which is kind of what the Shining sequence is about, where if you're obsessive about the movie and insist that it be just like the original, this is an abomination, right? I mean, it's actually a lot of meta things going on in that Shining sequence. Maybe we'll come back to, but the idea that this is Wade's advantage, that he truly loves this stuff and truly loves researching Halliday's life, and it's not a burden for him, it's an escape, gives him an advantage, that's fine. That's better than somebody who, purely memorizes it. So to me, it was more important that, whatever of value could be gained from these various things, Wade and his friends were pretty good at figuring it out. Whereas someone who just studied it, like the oologist, right? Like, they changed a little bit. It's the same idea. A bunch of people paid in a room to study it rotely as their job are never going to really embrace the themes of it, like someone who really loves it. And if you just, if you pretend we're not talking about pop culture and instead we're talking about like military tactics, that would be a totally reasonable plot for, a war movie where somebody understanding the battles before ends up helping them, win one today. So, So to me, Ernie had this line that I put in Atari Game Over, which was, I love things and I love people who love things. And I think that's the crucial thing is that, and it's true of Ernie, it's not enough to just say, well, I love it, so it's valuable. Like I love erasers and I spent my life collecting erasers and studying them. I don't know if that's valuable or not, but if it brings you together with a group of eraser lovers and eraser fans, then good. And I think that's what's true of a lot of fan bases and a lot of pop culture stuff is it's not about, it gets way beyond the specifics of the piece of art and into what type of group of people grow connected over it and how do they connect over it. And is it a negative or a positive connection? And most of the time it's a positive. And most groups of people who love a piece of work do not sit around, picking it apart and trying to destroy it. They're not critics, they're fans, right? I mean, criticism absolutely has its place. And I'm a very critical person when I see, with any pop culture I watch, I'm very critical. But that's an entirely different thing than being a fan of something and being brought together with other people over your, being fans. And this is something that is not questioned in sports, which I happen to be, I was the only sports fan on this movie, but like I'm also a big sports fan. Nobody questions why people are brought together by their love of a team, You question the people who take it way too far and do crazy, crazy stuff. But you don't question that bond because it just feels like it's natural. Well, that's true for all this stuff too.
Yeah, a friend of mine once said that when you know the results of a sports game from 1974, people would assume, yeah, okay, he's a baseball fan or a football fan or something. When you know the director of a certain movie and the cinematographer and you know who edited it, then people look at you like you're kind of crazy.
Right. It's true. And I can tell you as someone who knows both, like I can quote you baseball statistics that are so arcane, I can't believe I know them. I just learned them as a kid, so I can't forget them. But I also am I met my match in Ernie. I thought I, was pretty good at trivia, but once you meet Ernie, forget it. Whatever, if you think you're good, you're not. Because he knows like who shot the behind the scenes documentary and who the DP on that was. He knows, you know what I mean? He knows crazy stuff. But yeah, it's all about what effect it has on you as a person, and does it isolate you or bring you together with people in a positive way? So that's the crucial part of it. That's something that's very much in the book that's crucial, is that it is about 5 friends who join together because of a similar love, and that they're not just doing it for the result, they're doing it because they love it. And that's, crucial to the movie, I think. I mean, to the story of both books.
And I think it's one of the most charming aspects of it, that it's such a positive depiction of fandom, that it's truly people who love something. Because, I mean, especially if you look at the internet and in recent years, we've seen such a different side of fandom. And I'm sure it's just, just a small fraction of people, but they're very vocal and they're very toxic in how they attack everybody who is sort of connected with things that they get upset about. I mean, I don't know, I guess that you've had your share of experiences working on so many comic book and superhero movies to get that kind of reaction.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a pretty good view of all this because I started, the first adaptation I did was a draft of the first Hulk movie when I was in my 20s in the 90s, when, I was on the internet because my previous writing partner and I used to send scripts over the internet to each other to rewrite at times. But, there was no real internet culture. And I have, as I started working on more and more Marvel movies, the internet was booming. And so I saw the change from where there was no access for fans at first, right? So where it was just like it was always was, to there was some access for fans to the people behind the scenes and to the creators, more, limited to more specific sites and professional boards and things like that, to it exploding, And one of the things that happened when it exploded is suddenly, first of all, it's absolutely true, and I've been saying this to people since like 2003 or 5 or whatever, from my earliest experiences with fan message boards, was the people who hate it the most are going to drown out a lot of people, and it's going to seem like everybody hates it. I mean, there's a guy who, I don't know who it was, but there's someone who would post negative stuff about me on every message board in the early 2000s. And this is back when nobody told you, oh, don't go look at comments. And there's somebody on a message board, it felt to me like all these people were very critical of my work. And I realized it was the same person, just going from site to site under different names, saying the same thing. And I realized this is really counterproductive. 99% of these people are totally reasonable fans whose criticisms, half the time I agree with them, because as a writer, you don't have total control. But it's crazy to read that stuff because it gives you this impression that there's all these people who hate you out there. Now I think we've moved to a point where there are a lot of people, there's still a very small minority, but it's still a lot of people who are very vocal. And it's also empowered people. I think it's fine that fans, agitate for what they want up front. But there are people who obviously, the thought of saying this isn't exactly like the comic book and therefore it is bad is so inherently ludicrous. That I used to joke with because Ready Player One inspires a lot of people, fans of the book. There are a lot of people who, for their own reasons, are really obsessed with all of the trivia too. And so the thought that we didn't include any of it is very hard for them to take, which is obviously insane, because things that we legally can't get are not going to be in the movie. We can't put 10,000 references in the movie. We just can't. But also we don't want to. Like it's a different medium. It's not. And I used to say, like, what these fans want is for us to film the pages of the book being slowly turned so that they can, because that's the only true experience, right? This even be more true with a comic book. It's like, well, it sounds like what you want is an animated version of X-Men that is exactly like the comic book, and that's reasonable, but we're not doing that, and nor are we obviously we're not tearing up the comic books. I have them all, I have collections of them. So that becomes it's become a trickier thing to navigate, although, I at least got the early lesson of don't bother to read the comments, and you can't, sometimes fans have great ideas, by the way. Sometimes fans are like, they'll propose something, you're like, that is a great way to do this character on screen. But for the most part, yeah, it's just a lot of hating, a lot of trolling, and it's also just a misunderstanding about how inherently different a book is from a movie. Or, comic books are often closer. Like you can do, actually one example that I would use, because it's funny how it's evolved. I really loved Zack Snyder's director's cut of Watchmen. And if anything, I thought, well, here's a movie that fans of the book are going to love. But people, I was so shocked at how many people criticized it for being too close to the book. It's like, people said, like, there's a lot of people whose criticism was, it's like he took every page and translated onto the screen. It's like, okay, all right. Okay, now that's the thing. There's no answer. There's no successful answer to pleasing everybody who's a fan. You have to just forget it. It's just not possible. So, you just have to focus on making the best piece of art that you can be, that's still based on the source material, and that you're not callously changing things, that you're not for no reason changing the name of a character when it's perfectly fine the way it was. But that's, by the way, it's not always true. Like Marvel is a good example where there's some character names that were silly and amusing when Stan Lee came up with them. And I have talked in the past, to rest in peace to Stan Lee. And it was a name they came up with quickly that just sounded, they like alliterative names like Peter Parker or Bruce Banner. But after a while, some of the names get silly when they're said on screen. And so you have to kind of make choices about, what you're going to do. But yeah, anyway, I look, Atari Game Over is very much about how the rise of the internet kind of created a fandom that recreated the history of things for themselves, and that creeps out. Now the public history is E.T. destroyed the movie industry. That was never said until the internet came around. So, but yeah, there's also a lot of people out there who are very impassioned about some of the issues that Ready Player One does not deal with. And at least that has some social component to it that they're trying, it's one thing to express, well, I didn't like that the Iron Giant's leg was, 6 inches bigger than he was in the original movie. It's another to say, well, it feels like, the female character is just a goal and not someone who has an active role in the movie. I mean, that's a more legitimate criticism. Some of it, I agreed with and tried to address. But sometimes it's like, okay, well, that's reasonable, but it is true that for everything you do, there's someone who's going to loathe it. So you just have to kind of tune it out. And it is I think it's both a criticism of the gatekeeping aspect of fandom, if you would, Ready Player One. It's a criticism of that, in my opinion, certainly the movie. But it's even more a criticism of the haters, of people who just want to hate things, because that is who Sorrento is to a certain extent. He doesn't understand it, so he hates it. But yeah, so it's very much, the last couple of movies I've made are, actually, I guess, particularly Atari Game Over and Ready Player One, but even to a certain extent, Incident at Loch Ness, this other movie I made with Werner Herzog, are kind of about this phenomenon.
Yeah, maybe we'll get to Incident at Loch Ness. You were talking about the references in both the book and the movie, and there are obviously a lot of different references for some reason or other. You mentioned that a couple of things that you didn't get the rights to. My question would be, why do you think there is such a fascination with the iconography of the 80s in pop culture, especially these days?
Well, I think there's a number of good reasons. First of all, it was an era in which a number of these art forms, such as, comic books, video games, obviously, and even big, giant popular movies, it started in the 70s, but by the 80s, it was exploding in popularity. So, and even in terms of the music fandom, like a lot of things, that was the heyday of it. I actually think it'll be interesting to see if 20 years from now, there'll be an explosion in, nostalgia for TV of the last 10 years, or, content for streamers and content for, that's shown on a television, just because that, or even YouTube content, because that's what kids grew up with, right? But when you talk about, I do think there's natural cycles. In the 70s, people were nostalgic for the 50s. It makes sense that like at a certain point, the 80s turn would come around. And I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is that it's natural that when the people of that generation come of age, those are the touch points for them that they're going to come back to. So when people my age, when I first got to Hollywood in 1990, the first thing I wanted to do was go pitch a take on Iron Man. It's something I'd been thinking about, like with CG. I was a big Cameron fan. I thought this is something that could be made. And, there were no takers, and Marvel was in bankruptcy, and it seemed like a ridiculous idea. And then I wanted to work on X-Men, and that was going nowhere, and the Hulk, the same thing. But, a lot of times when I would talk to executives at the time, when I was very young, when I was in my 20s, I couldn't explain to them, like, no, these aren't, I know it seems to you like a cartoon, but it's not. There are really good stories here and they're meaningful. And as my generation, grew up in Hollywood, or whatever, ascended in Hollywood, those things that we loved, one of them being comic books, which got significantly better, I would argue, in the 70s, like took a, certainly a quantum leap in the 60s, but I think even more of one in the late 70s. You suddenly have all these people who were big fans of this stuff. And so it slowly goes from people treating comic books like a bastard stepchild to, like something that's worthy of adaptation. And with video games, that's unquestionably the case, because video games weren't even created until the, mass market video games. Well, you can go watch Atari Game Over if you want the history of video games, but obviously that's going to lead you back to the 80s, because that's really when that industry exploded. So I think it's not so surprising that, there's so many content creators who are of a certain age, Gen X, if you will. And so the things that they really loved have overtaken what used to be 50s or 60s nostalgia, or, even 70s nostalgia. And the 80s nostalgia, I think, is passing, honestly. I think we'll move past it pretty soon. And I felt in the movie, we shouldn't, Halliday, everything Halliday does, I felt should obviously, like the book, be 80s centric, because that's who he is. But that the whole Oasis shouldn't be that way. The whole Oasis has to have people who are fans of other stuff in it. So the architecture of the Oasis might be 80s influenced, but there had to be stuff from Game of Thrones and The Matrix and Lord of the Rings and all sorts of other stuff, because, not everyone would be obsessed with it. But I do think there is a certain inevitable cycle. I think the internet has had a lot to do with the people who came of age in that time also were the first people to really en masse use the internet, not to the extent that our own children did, but so I think there's a lot of good explanations for why American 80s pop culture in particular, MTV, I think was a big, influence on that generation. So it doesn't surprise me that happened. It really doesn't. I was kind of waiting for it to happen.
I kind of feel, though, that it's a fairly new phenomenon, that the nostalgia is combined with so many quotes, direct quotes and references to something. Like if you look at the movies of the 70s or 80s, yes, there is a certain nostalgia for earlier times. American Graffiti plays in the 50s, and Peggy Sue Gets Married plays in the 50s, movies like that. But they don't reference exact characters, and like I said, the iconography and the music is just sort of that's because it's a period piece in a way. Mm-hmm. Whereas these days, you even have a lot of stuff that is made to look as if it was made during the 80s. Like there are video games, retro games that use that 8-bit pixel look, and you have music that sounds as if it was produced straight out of 1985. And that I couldn't see that in like 1973. You wouldn't have a recording that would sound like it came from 1943.
Yeah, although interestingly, what about take Led Zeppelin, for example, right? Led Zeppelin, it's all based on very well-known blues from decades before, and they really just took a whole bunch of blues songs and updated. By the way, I love their music for different reasons, but that's what it is. But I would say that, of course, that's true. And a lot of that has to do with how culture gets, spread so much wider. So that's one thing. But certainly, there's a whole part in Atari Game Over about lists, about how when the internet first started, one of the biggest things was making lists, top 10 lists, top 10 worst, top 100 lists. There was an explosion in lists. And when I was a kid, there was a book called The Book of Lists that was really popular. And it was just one book that had a ton of lists in it. But the internet just became lists and lists and lists. So I think because of the orientation, like the early internet was just really focused on lists of stuff that happened to focus on the 80s. But you know, I think you'll see, I've already seen a bunch of 90s stuff coming out, like creeping in, where people are doing stuff that looks very 90s, if you will. So, which is a distinctive look. It's like a worse, in some way, it's like a worse video quality look, weirdly, because it's not even retro enough. But, you know, it's also, there was a very extraordinarily productive period. You know, there are good periods where a lot of interesting stuff comes out that stays iconic. You know, I mean, if stuff comes out, you know, if Prince's work stays popular for 4 decades, that probably says something about Prince's work, you know, not as much about, oh, it's from the 80s, so we love it. And I think there were a lot of people working at the height of their, you know, talent in that decade. But yeah, you know, who can say? I mean, who knows exactly why? I mean, I know that my generation grew up quoting stuff to the point that it annoys younger generations. Like if you quote Caddyshack, when I was in college, quoting Caddyshack was a totally funny, real, you know, like everyone knew what you were talking about. Now it's like, shut up with the Caddyshack shit, you know, quotes. Like I've heard them, you know, or any number of things, you know, it's just people naturally grow tired of them. But I do think it's also that people obsessively watch. I mean, my kids have, by the way, you were talking earlier about memorizing movies. I mean, you know, I've seen some movie, I've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I couldn't tell you how many times. I mean, I do not have the movie memorized. I don't have any movie that I've written memorized. You know, like that's crazy to me. I mean, I could reproduce half of it maybe for you, and certainly not all the dialogue. So that's just another level of obsession. And I think part of it is that, you know, back in my day, you had to have a VCR and pause and rewind. You know, if you really wanted to catch every line, it wasn't easy. Now you just go up on the internet and look up a transcript of what everyone's saying. So leads to more quotes.
Yeah, my sister used to put the tape recorder next to the TV so that she could tape the movies. That was before VCRs were common, so that she could listen to the movies over and over again.
Oh, just listen to them. Oh, that I didn't do, but I did. I used to record songs from the radio that way.
Mm-hmm, me too.
I'd hear something and I'd click record on a separate recorder, and I'd get, you know, I'd make tapes for people, and they had ridiculous, like the end of a commercial in the, you know, just because I didn't do it in time. But yeah, it was a different era.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Ready Player One is with Steven Spielberg as a director, you have a guy who is sort of responsible for a lot of the pop culture that is quoted in this world. I was wondering, was there some kind of discussion while you were going through all of the references and all of the worlds that you were creating about that, you know, that it's sometimes that he was involved in doing that?
Oh, I mean, were there some discussions? It was incessant. First of all, we had to strip all the Spielberg references out, which, you know, I mean, Ernie and I joked with him. I mean, I specifically said to him, it's really annoying how many great movies you made or produced. Making my job. I used to give him I was like, you're making my job so much harder. Like, I totally forgot you produced blank or whatever, or we can't even make an ER reference. You produced that too. Not that we were going to. So yeah, it came up all the time. The other thing is that every time you start talking about a movie, I mean, one of the greatest moments of my life was one of the first meetings I had with Steven. There was a Blade Runner sequence in the movie, and originally, and I went into his theater with him and we watched the sequence in question. And, you know, Steven and Ridley Scott obviously go way back. I think Steven was on the set at some points of Blade Runner because he was about to make Indiana, you know, I forget, maybe he was making the second Raiders movie at that point, but whatever. Everything we're talking about, he had a hand in. You know, there's a day on set that we were talking about Scarface. We were actually talking about weapons that they might use. We were talking about Scarface, and Steven said, we started talking about the scene, the say hello to my little friend scene. And Steven was like, yeah, no, I shot some of that. And we were like, what? And it was me and some of the actors like, what do you mean you shot some of Scarface? It's Brian. Like, Brian called me. He needed someone to shoot the reverse angles of Al Pacino. And it came out in a documentary. Like he said, I can tell you this because he had never told anyone because he didn't want to like say he shot stuff. But Brian De Palma, a documentary came out about him right while we were making the movie where he told the story. So he told us, and we're just like, what weren't you there for? You know? So which is awesome. You know, like it was thrilling, you know, to be able to talk to him about this stuff. But it did make things harder because he has a hand in so much pop culture. I mean, I had such a good joke about how hard it was to park the mothership from Close Encounters. That was like a runner that I had in my first script. I mean, it made me laugh all the time because if you know the mothership, like where could you park that thing? And you know, out of the script, can't do that. Can't do a Close Encounters joke. So, you know, Back to the Future is the one allowance that he made because he felt like it was too, you know, intrinsic to the storytelling that he left it in there. But it was a big pain in the ass. On the other hand, you know, Steven's ability to get people to let him use their material is insane. I mean, the stuff that's in this movie, nobody else could have gotten people, you know, nobody else could have gotten the things that we got. It's just, you know, Steven knows, I mean, whatever, he's the greatest filmmaker we've ever had. You know, he's a force unto himself. And so, you know, once you have him, the sky's the limit. I mean, the fact that we got The Shining, you know, Ernie was like, if I thought even for a second we would get The Shining, like a Stanley Kubrick movie, I would have definitely done something with it. And when he was like, yeah, let's do The Shining, we were just, you know, we were like giggling, like he was best friends with Stanley Kubrick, of course. But it was a lot of work, honestly. It was a lot of work staying away from Spielberg stuff. It's pretty funny how often something would come up and then we'd be like, we can't do it, you know? And they dropped some Easter eggs in there. The ILM guys and Ernie, they did one or two for me. There's like a Last Action Hero Easter egg I didn't know was coming, but there's a bunch for Steven that, you know, they didn't point out to him until after the movie was done. But, you know, that's about all we could do. But yeah, that's the one downside of working with Steven is he's made too many good movies. So.
Yeah, you have there's this Jack Slater marquee on during the race sequence, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know it. By the way, I had watched that race sequence because I was in all the pre and post-production meetings about it. Like Steven was so incredibly generous and had me come to any meeting I wanted to go to. So I went to all, you know, he wanted me to work with all the board artists, but then even in his effects reviews, I mean, if you can imagine sitting and watch Steven Spielberg do an effects review and critique material for its cinematic quality, it's pretty insane. I mean, it's an insane experience. It's, you know, you want to be just taking notes and recording it, which you're not supposed to do, so you don't. But it was insane to do that, and I never saw the Last Action Hero frames until it was too late. So, I mean, they were clever about it. They made sure to keep that shot. That marquee was probably blank, you know, up until the last time I saw it, and then they dropped that in. So, but yeah, it was fun actually seeing some of the stuff. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a movie quite like it, or ever, I don't know if there ever will be, but you know, where it is just so jam-packed. You know, I don't even think it's appropriate to call them Easter eggs because it's just the fabric of the movie, you know, is all of these pop culture references. That's the part of the point, you know?
Yeah, in a way, I think Steven Spielberg is almost a kind of Halliday figure in that sense. I certainly had the feeling while watching the movie that he was connecting very much with that person who is so immersed in pop culture.
You know, what's funny is that I agree. I think you're right. And I think that Steven and Mark Rylance have a great connection and are very fond of each other, you know. But the truth is, Steven is Morrow. I mean, Steven certainly has Halliday's talent, but he is not, if you think about it, there's a lot of other people, I won't name names, who are a lot like Halliday, many of whom don't even realize how much like Halliday they are. But Steven is, you know, he's a humanist. He's so much warmer. He's, you know what I mean? There's not this, he's made movies in so many different genres. He has so many different interests. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like this is where, I mean, this is a guy who has tremendous interest in history and all sorts of other things, and certainly cinema. But it's weird sometimes. I would have to remind Steven, because I could tell there's times where I was pitching something about Halliday and it bothered Steven because he felt like you could almost see like, it was partly like Mark was playing it in such a sympathetic way that he didn't want to think badly of him. But I also think that he probably, of course, he associates with Halliday. You know, it's funny, people say it's lonely at the top. I mean, Steven has an enormous family and they're always around, and all of his friends with a million people. So it's not like, you know, he's ever truly alone, but it is lonely when I do see it, getting to sit next to him for a year or two, watching every single person that comes up to him is emotionally charged, wants to talk about him. It's very hard for them to have a normal conversation with him. And Steven's still a person, a regular guy. And he's not like, you know, a professional athlete who travels every day of the year and lives in his own bubble. He's a person who, like, you know, kind of has a regular life and does stuff. And so I see it's hard when your work means so much to people that, like, they act differently around you. And I'm sure he could associate with some of those qualities that Halliday had. I'm sure there's some sense of like, I wish I could just retreat into my childhood home, or I could do this, that, or the other. But it is funny because I don't think Steven's anything like Halliday. I think he might think he is, but he's wrong. I mean, he's far more Morrow, but, you know, that's not even fair. He would never leave the leadership of his company to somebody who passed a test of trivia of things he liked. You know, like, that's not what he would do. So, but it is an interesting thing about the movie. And I do think, like, one sequence, there's only one or two critics who I think who really nailed what we were going for in the Shining sequence, which was both the hardest sequence to write. I mean, we wrote a million versions of it because this was one thing Ernie and I really worked together on, you know, both on set and off. But one of the things about the Shining sequence that I think is incredibly subversive, it's Steven Spielberg going back and redirecting a movie made by the most obsessive and perfectionist director who even, you know, Steven sees as an icon whose material is not to be touched. You know, like, he would not re-edit the actual Shining. But part of the point of the sequence is this is sacred, right? Like, even to Steven, you know, the Shining, it's canon, it's sacred. You can't mess with it. And what happens? There's sight gags, there's zombies, there's things that are definitely not in The Shining in any version of it. There's some things that are from the book, some things are from the movie. There's like lots of silliness that's totally inappropriate to the movie. I mean, it's a deconstruction somewhat. I don't know if it's a deconstruction, but it's basically taking the things that you love about The Shining and very intentionally screwing around with them. And that is what the scene is about, right? In the movie, the characters remark, we're not supposed to be slavishly loyal to The Shining. That's clear. Look at what's happened so far. I mean, Wade says there's the gatekeeping fandom is summed up in one sentence where Wade's like, that's not what happens in The Shining. And Artemis says, maybe that's the point, you know? And that's kind of what we got at. And the funny thing is, Steven just kind of did it that way. That's what felt right to him, was to take The Shining and you know, at one point we even incorporated elements from 2001 and other Kubrick movies. There's an incredible chase where, you know, the bathroom in The Shining turned into the wheel from 2001. It never actually got made that way. But I think what's so subversive about the sequence is, here's Steven Spielberg, the supposedly most nostalgic director, and he is going back and saying, this stuff is not sacred. Nothing is above, you know, it's wonderful, but it doesn't mean we can't do something different with it. It doesn't mean that we have to bow our heads and only speak about it in certain phrases. And I think it's a very interesting sequence. I think people will be writing essays about it in the years ahead about what the intention behind that sequence is, because it's complicated, you know? I mean, Kubrick is a bit of a Halliday type figure, right? I mean, he's got a lot of Halliday type qualities. So I think that's something that a lot of people get overwhelmed by all the references and don't realize what the movie is actually trying to say at times, which is great. By the way, I think it's totally fine. It's kind of good when you don't figure out until later. And there's plenty of people who watch Fight Club who totally missed the point, you know, the first 10 times they saw it. So that's one of the things I like about the movie, and particularly about that sequence, is it is Steven doing something seems so unlike him. You know, if you'd said, "I got to see this movie," Steven eviscerates a Stanley Kubrick sequence and kind of makes fun of him in it. If you know Steven, you'd be like, "There's no what? He would never do that." You know, he loved Stanley, but he understands, and Stanley would have. I guarantee you, he would tell you Stanley would have been completely amused by the whole thing. I mean, I can't speak enough to his personal thoughts about this, but I feel like there's elements of that in the movie that only Steven Spielberg could do, because it's only relevant, you know, in the same way when you watch Unforgiven without Clint Eastwood's body of work, that movie does not work the same way. I mean, it is playing off his body of work. This movie, the fact that Steven Spielberg made it provides a tremendous amount of the meaning that you can pull from it. You know, it's not, those two cannot be separated, in my opinion. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially since the Kubrick connection is also relevant to his, when he made AI, for example.
Well, and also personal. I mean, it was they were very, very good friends for many years. So.
And I always loved the sequence because of the interactivity. That's kind of, I found that more interesting than, you know, being part of a movie and then having to quote all of the dialogue. I mean, I'm sure that's fun, but sort of stepping into a movie and being allowed to explore that world of the movie on your own, that is like an amazing thought. And
I was just going to say, you're talking to someone who the first big idea I had for a movie before I even came to Hollywood was Last Action Hero. I mean, it was a kid who was based on kind of me growing up in New York City, getting to go into a movie, like a dumb action movie that he loved. I mean, you know, so to me, I actually really felt like working on Ready Player One and watching the final product was like seeing, and particularly the Shining sequence, I was like, that's what I've always wanted to see since I, you know, was 22. I really wanted to see someone do this. So it was very exciting to me personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to mention Last Action Hero, and I think that's also where Incident at Loch Ness comes into play. That sort of deconstruction, sort of taking apart and then putting something together, playing with the form, and that meta level, movies about movies.
Yep. I mean, Incident at Loch Ness, I mean, it's still, I think it's the best thing I've ever done, you know. I don't know all the way, it's hard for me to judge, obviously, but it's the thing that I'm proud of. And it's similar in that, you know, I was also, as a kid, you know, my parents took me to a ton of foreign films. I wasn't just like a comic book geek. And, you know, Werner Herzog, I became a huge fan of his work in college, particularly. But when I got the chance to work with him, you know, it was another thing where I said, absolutely, yes, Werner Herzog, I'm there, whatever, you know, I helped him work on the script. But that movie is about Werner Herzog in the same way, in a lot of the same ways that Ready Player One is about Steven Spielberg. Now, Incident at Loch Ness is much more overtly about Werner Herzog. It's literally about him, but it's not, you know, that's still not Werner. He's still acting, you know, he's still playing the part of Werner Herzog in the movie. And I'm playing the part of a horrible version of myself. But yes, it is also, it's almost like, what if you could walk into a documentary about yourself which is kind of what's happening to Werner. And we kind of treated him that way. We didn't tell him a lot of the stuff that was going to happen. We purposely like sprung it on him. Like, the bikini model, he knew something was coming, but he didn't know exactly what it was going to be. And my friend Michael Carnow, who's in it, the cryptozoologist, was a lot of the stuff he said to Werner. I mean, Michael improvised something. This is getting very deep. You have to really watch the movie. But if you notice, he offers to give Werner his autograph rather than he comes up and says, I can sign this for you, which Werner, had no idea was coming, and he laughs very genuinely. But yeah, I mean, look, I always have been fascinated by how, how story is created, how the form dictates story. The idea that like there are multiple layers of truth to what you're making, and that you can read something on multiple levels and it can still be interesting and exciting and funny. It doesn't have to be dry in order to be working on multiple, well, dry is good, but it doesn't have to be boring to work on multiple levels. But I think I've always, since I was a kid, like even the plays I wrote were absurdist. I've always, at the same time that I love the stuff I work on, I'm also have an eye on the parody of it or the satire of it, and maybe that's because I grew up watching Airplane and movies like that, or Monty Python for that matter. But like, I'm always looking for a way to weave that in. Yeah. So, I mean, and Incident at Loch Ness is one of the only times I had no idea why I was doing it. I mean, the idea came to me one day while I was hanging out with Werner. The next day, I said, what if we went and did this? And he said, sure. And 3 or 4 months later, we were off doing it. And I really didn't know what people would say. What is it? Is it a horror movie? I was like, I don't even know. We'll see what it is when I finish. So, that's one of those moments where it's like, you can't really, whatever it came out as. I mean, it's clearly, the whole thing is obviously a metaphor for my experiences in Hollywood. I mean, I'm playing the producer who said to me, hey, let's take the plot from your other movie and put it in this movie. And I was like, the plot? I mean, that is what my script, like that's the whole movie. So yeah, that was coming from a slightly darker place, although my affection for Werner is obviously very positive. But it's also, by the way, the same thing about like people holding Werner up as this, they do believe he's a mythical figure. I mean, he is a mythical figure, but I also think people think he's literally bulletproof or something. I mean, he's been shot a lot of times. So, but he's still a person, and he lives in a house and he goes and buys razor blades and he does the things that we all do. And, that's kind of what the movie's, that's one of the obvious plots of it or points of it.
Yeah, the Incident at Loch Ness was kind of responsible for the fact that when I saw your Atari documentary, I was first being skeptical if that was the real thing. Because, I knew, okay, Incident at Loch Ness is fake. And then you did The Grand, which took the documentary form for a fictitious story. And so when the Atari thing started, I was like, yeah, well, maybe there's a twist at the end that was going to tell me that it's all a sham, but it's a real documentary, right?
Yeah. Well, by the way, I love that. I didn't think enough people had seen Incident at Loch Ness, although I was hired because they had seen Incident at Loch Ness and they were worried we weren't going to find anything. So they wanted someone. I had a pretty good comedy laid out about me completely failing to make a good documentary, where we find nothing. It was going to be like Al Capone's vault, the famous, there's nothing in there when they opened it. But actually what happened was the first day of filming, Howard Warshaw, and it was like, oh, wait, there's a story here to be told no matter what. So I'm going to tell it. But I definitely played with that a lot. And I to me, it was very amusing. There was other people didn't like it as much, but I felt it played well for people who saw it. The whole idea that I keep talking about, there's going to be amazing graphics on here, and then we show some graphics that are very silly, and that I'm constantly asking dumb questions. I'm doing like my own little Louis Theroux impersonation, if you know his work. But yeah, I definitely wanted there to be, because it is a hoax. In the end, there aren't a million ET cartridges buried. It didn't destroy the film industry. If you've seen it, like it is a hoax built by the internet that points to a truth that has some validity that we dug up literally, and so, and weirdly is, I was using all these Spielberg references, not thinking I would soon be meeting with Steven Spielberg, that wasn't coming to mind, but yeah, I mean, it's very much, that's something I really liked with Incident at Loch Ness. The first crowds that saw it in the Q&A afterwards, there's a lot of people who were very angry at me. And it took a while for somebody to point out, but it says you directed this movie. I mean, this didn't actually happen. It's like, maybe it did, or maybe this is my counter propaganda. I just like messing with people, and so did Werner. But yeah, Atari, it easily could have ended up that way. It's just, if you stumble on a good story, you tell it first. I mean, I would never undo a good story that I found in front of me, because what's the point? It's hard to come by a good story, but yeah, it's definitely, it's something that I kind of hoped, like one of the things that we did in Incident at Loch Ness that amused me and my friend, Michael Carnow, who I created Alphas with, we always like the idea of, confusing a hoax with totally pointless lies that, like, so in Incident at Loch Ness, all the people are who they say they are. Those are all real people. I mean, we did cast a lot of them, but that's who they are in real life. We cast Gabby Beristain as the DP, whatever. But it's also filled with misinformation and filled with, like, the house where Werner's house, he lived 2 miles from me, but we shot his house as my house, and then shot, whatever. We did all these different things. And we also did press releases that made no sense. We started a rumor that Werner had flown a humpback whale into Loch Ness, and that's how he did the effects. And that started, and Werner denied it, which ironically made people think it was true. So, I'm always fascinated by stuff like that, about how, I do think it's a bit ahead of its time, because it was very much about, look how easy it is to get people to believe something if it's printed someplace online. We announced that Werner Herzog's making a documentary. The next day, the BBC called me and asked if they could make a documentary about this Herzog documentary I was producing. And I was so tempted to say yes. I was so tempted to let them come, but I just felt like we would never get our movie made, but it would have been brilliant if they had. So. Yeah.
So it's interesting how you can create that sort of reality with a movie, that sort of fake reality, and sort of people just come to it with their own assumptions and say, well, yeah, this is the real thing.
Right. And it's gotten scary. Like when I made it, I just thought, this is something that amuses me, is the way that the modern era of technology has created these fake realities that people believe in, right? And I tried to do something benign, like, who cares that if we saw Nessie or didn't, Werner announced that he was going to catch it. He was going to catch it and kill it and people took him seriously, which is hilarious to think that he's going to catch and kill something that doesn't exist. But it was fairly benign at that time. But I think you've also seen in the past 10 years how ugly it can get, where when you put out false propaganda, or when you simply just dispute facts over anything, even small things, just to confuse people, it's not a joke anymore, but I do think some of what I was getting at in Incident at Loch Ness, and even in the Atari documentary, it was what I was seeing that was kind of weird to me, where people were living in this reality where this is what they knew to be true about this movie, or about, this piece of content. And now it's just, nobody knows what the hell is going on. Nobody even knows. I actually had very recently toyed with doing, actually even a couple of years ago, doing a documentary about a fake, and Peter Jackson did something like this, but this would have been about a fake television show, like, that was enormously popular, but I would make it seem so real that, I wanted people to think that, like, this show had been made, and how did they miss it, and then I just didn't, because other things came up. But but I am fascinated over and over with that feeling of like trying to get to the bottom of the movie itself, not just the story, but what's behind it.
Just one thing, I mean, we touched upon this with the Atari documentary, is that it seems so much like a precursor to what you were doing with Ready Player One, with Ernest Cline, with Steven Spielberg, but also there's the story of adventure in it with the Easter egg that it's mentioned in Ernest's book, but just briefly, but it plays such a huge part in Ready Player One. And I think even the Howard Warshaw, I think even his character sort of connects to the kind of Jim Halliday figure. So how much of an influence was that working on the film?
It was a tremendous influence. You can't see it right here, but that adventure, the first ET cartridge and the first adventure cartridge are right over there on my wall, hung up. Adventure, Ernie and I talked about this a lot, how adventure for people of our age freaked us out. The idea that there's this secret, like the day I found The Secret, by Warren Robinette, was like, as a kid, it just blew my mind. I felt like I'd found like pirate treasure or something. And adventure for me summed up, and it's mentioned in the book, and it's clearly a huge influence on Ernie, and he's a Atari fanatic. And I just felt like it was too perfect. Of all the things, if we were going to play one game, that was the perfect game, because it's about the creator trying to leave their signature in their work and hiding it, and there's almost a contest to do it. It just seemed like, and I will say that Atari Game Over was an incubator for Ready Player One. Christy McCosco-Krieger, who's the producer, and Adam Stockhausen, the production designer, watched Atari Game Over before we even started and used a lot of it as inspiration. And me and Ernie were like bathing in the, it sounds horrible, but like bathing in the Atari juices of it all. And absolutely, I wouldn't have written a good script, I don't think. And I think it was very inspiring to me, and even to some other people. The experience of making that movie just was like the perfect proving ground for some of the ideas in Ready Player One. And it also brought me and Ernie close together, which was good, because I think things always go better when the various creators, when they're all on the same wavelength. It's not the way it's done in Hollywood, but it should be. But like when the book's author and the screenwriter and the director and the production designer and the producer, if everybody is kind of seeing the same thing, there's something good. But an adventure just felt like, it's just the facts of adventure. Adventure was our Werner Herzog. Like the facts of Werner Herzog make him who he is. Like he did actually do those things. So it's not like we made them up. That's true. Adventure is a game that has a history, unlike Joust, which is a great game, but doesn't have a history like this. Adventure has a history it's the first puzzle, it's the first Easter egg. You know what I mean? It's just too perfect to not use. So, and it was fun also being like, that was one thing I had a lot of, expertise in, is how to hold your joystick and what to do when you're playing adventure, because on the set we needed to do some of that. So, but yeah, all of that and that experience, we would comment all the time on how surreal it was and how relevant it was to what we were doing. And I think a lot of that love came out in the movie too, was really reconnecting with that past, because I was playing, I've been playing video games my whole life. I don't play Atari anymore. I play on an Xbox so, to me, it was great to go back to that. And it was definitely like the perfect place to prepare for, what became like a 4-year adventure, of writing and then working with Steven and making the movie.